This is sort of where we left off with the Reconstruction period. So, the end of the Reconstruction period, we start to see the rise of the KKK's political power in the South. And the KKK, they're of the Democratic Party mostly. We also see that while African Americans have gained rights with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, the government isn't really protecting those rights. So we have many African Americans are still sort of treated with violence and discrimination in the South. Now we're going to look a little bit to what is happening westward. So we're looking at some changes on the western frontier. Now, when we left off with the western frontier, we left off with the idea of manifest destiny. Our objectives for this week, the culture clash on the prairies, is we have contrast the cultures of Native Americans and white settlers. So we're going back to discussing conflicts with Native Americans in the western part of the U.S. We're going to identify restrictions imposed by the government on Native Americans and describe those consequences. We're going to identify the government's policy of assimilation, as well as continuing conflict between Native Americans and settlers. We're also going to trace the development of the cattle industry. We're probably not going to focus much on this one, and we're going to describe the myth and reality of the American cowboy. Again, probably not going to focus on that one as well. So, just so that you get an idea of where we're talking about when we're talking about the prairie, this is Middle America. Okay, so when we know that the starting colonization of America happened on the East Coast, and it slowly has made its way westward with this idea of manifest destiny. We're talking about this middle area, which is still known as the prairies today. So this is going to be areas like Kansas, Nebraska, South Dakota, North Dakota, all the way to Illinois. Okay. So we have the division of the tall grass prairie, the mixed prairie, and the short grass prairie, okay? If we thought about before the Civil War, most of this area was still Indian territory. This is in 1934. Mexico still belonged to sort of Spain and later the country of Mexico, this whole area. So just a reminder, can you guys tell me what was manifest destiny? And what were some of the events that led to colonizing the West? So this is sort of review from before. This is what we look at when we think of the prairies. It's very flat land. And the main source of food on the prairies for many of the natives was bison. Okay, so bison ends up becoming a very important part of prairie life. So let's discuss a little bit about what the culture was of the Plain Indians. We would say Native Americans. So the Great Plains people, they had a very specific type of lifestyle, and it all revolved around the buffalo, a certain animal. When the Spanish ended up bringing horses to these people, it changed their lives. They were able to hunt buffalo quite easily. They also when they hunted buffalo, they are eating the meat. They're also making their houses out of it. We call them teepees. They're also quite a spiritual people. They believe in the spirits of the natural world. And many women would become shamans or spiritual medicine leaders of their communities. Overall, the way of life is very communal. The men are often going out and hunting, and the women are staying back, and they're the ones sort of controlling life in the camps. Many of these people were very nomadic, so they would sort of live on the land and move around. So here we have as an example of warriors and hunting bison or buffalo. Here's an example of what a traditional teepee is like. Now, when you think of probably the stereotype of Native Americans, you're probably thinking of the Plains people, the idea of this teepee. Well, eventually we know that the settlers are pushing westward. So as natives did not improve the land, they had no right to claim the land. That is sort of the mentality of the natives. But now we have is sort of a very strong force, many white settlers moving here. Many of the settlers that were moving westward were moving for the idea of gold. So they wanted to possibly mine for gold. It's the idea of the gold rush in general. We've talked about this before. And while many of these settlers were white, we have actually quite a big mix of different type of immigrants moving. So people like the Irish, German, Polish. We also start to see some Chinese moving this way, as well as African Americans. It's the idea of new opportunity. Now, the more that we have white settlers moving west, as we see for gold and silver, for the work on the railroads, or because of the Homestead Act, we start to see that a clash with these Great Plains Native Americans. Now, in the 1830s, the Great Plains was designated as a vast reservation. So it's a huge piece of land designated for many different native tribes. But by 20 years later, many of these treaties end up having set boundaries. So each tribe gets a certain amount of land. Many of these natives didn't really listen to these reservations or these boundaries. They would just continue hunting and gathering on the land that they've always hunted and gathered on. And this is what led to a lot of the clashes in this area. There are three particular native wars that we're going to look at from 1864 to 1890. We're going to divide this up into three main parts. So first we're going to look at the Sandy Creek Massacre. Then we're going to look at many different little battles and wars that happened. And finally, the Battle at Wounded Knee. So with Indian Wars, we have a list here that shows wars fought between 1800s with the U.S. government and Native Americans. Now, if you can imagine, this is quite a long list, okay? This clash with Native Americans is something that happens quite often. One of the saddest sort of events during this period is the massacre at Sandy Creek. So in 1846, we have the Colorado militia. They go into the Chennai tribe's camp and they kill over 400 Native Americans. Now, most of these Native Americans were not men. They did not fight. They were women and children. And the saddest part of this was that this tribe believed that they were under the protection of the U.S. government. So they believed that they had a right to be at Sandy Creek as it was law. And so what ends up happening is this man, John Chivington, he is the one who sort of starts the order. So he's the one who's killing and scalping all big and little. So if you imagine, scalping is cutting off the top part of someone's head. So they're going into these small camps. They surprise attack the Chennai and they're killing tons of people. Our next event is the death of the Bozeman Trail. So it's another sort of bloody event. Now, the Bozeman Trail, it was a trail that went right through the Sioux tribe's land. And what would end up happening is many settlers would go through the Bozeman Trail and would take land and settle there. This sort of upset the Sioux tribe, and therefore they went to the government to try and appeal to close this trail. What ended up happening was the government wasn't really listening, so we have a specific warrior named Crazy Horse who ends up ambushing soldiers on the Bozeman Trail and killing over 80 of them. The result of this sort of ambush is the government decides to close the Bozeman Trail for the Sioux tribe. The Sioux tribe also is granted territory and government assistance such as agriculture, education, and health. The Sioux, in response, they're going to end the protests against the railroads that are also going through their territory. And they also said that they will no longer attack settlers who settle near their land. In 1874 marks another sort of battle with another native tribe. This is the Red River War. So this is with two tribes, the Comanche tribe as well as the Kiowa tribe. These two tribes would often raid the U.S. Army and sort of take things whenever they could from the American government. In response, in 1875, the U.S. Army is coming into the plains. They are dividing up the tribes that are peaceful to the tribes that are not. And the ones that are peaceful, they are going to go on reservations. The ones that are not, the U.S. Army does an open fire. So here we have sort of a quote about this war: destroy their villages, their ponies, to kill and hang all warriors, and to bring back all women and children. So this is kind of an example of total war. All right, they're going to destroy the villages, destroy livestock. They're going to kill the men, and they're going to bring back women and children. The Treaty of Fort Laramie, which was signed after the death at Bozeman Trail, it sort of ends up being ignored very soon after the treaty. So in 1874, we have this man, George A. Cluster. He's reporting that in the area of the Sioux tribe, there's a lot of gold to be had. So whether the Sioux wanted people there or not, we have a huge rush of people looking for gold in their area. So here's an example of, as you can see, these are all wagons going to Colorado to find the gold mine. And here we have sort of villages that spring up overnight trying to find gold. Okay. We also have the Custer's Last Stand. Custer's Last Stand marks a win for the Sioux tribe. So we have Sitting Bull, who is the leader of the Sioux. He ends up having a vision of war. And he was right, the American troops are coming. And when they come, the Sioux end up being ready for them. So Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, who are both the leaders of the Sioux tribe and warriors, they are able to defeat these American troops. But eventually, about a few years later, we have the Americans force them to surrender. So Sitting Bull ends up actually going to Canada to seek refuge. The aftermath of Custer's Last Stand is we have increased military presence in this area. We also have the Native American opposition is completely destroyed. We also have the rise of assimilation. So many of the Native American tribes are starting to be assimilated into white culture. Two markers of assimilation for Native Americans is the Dawes Act and the destruction of the buffalo. So the Dawes Act was in 1887, and what it was trying to do was Americanize natives, which is an easy way to say make them more white or assimilated into white culture. And the way they did this is, instead of having vast land for all tribes, they were going to divide up these reservations into individual lands for Native Americans. The extra land they ended up selling to settlers. So if you can imagine, any family was given 160 acres, and any individual adult male was given about 80 acres. There was a lot of extra land which they were able to sell, and they had promised that some of that money was going to go to these Native American tribes. But in the end, the Native Americans receive none of the money that is sold off by their land. And we also see that Americans end up taking 1/3 of their land away. So basically, this ends up resulting in Native Americans' land is taken away. The second thing is the destruction of the buffalo. Now, the buffalo was the Great Plains way of life. And we start to see the destruction and exploitation of these animals. So while the natives have sort of a spiritual attachment to these animals, many tourists would come in and they would just shoot them for sport. We also have fur traders, and this destroys the buffalo population. So this upsets Native Americans quite a bit. This is a pile of bison skulls. So imagine just how many buffalo have been killed. Here we go is carcasses that are killed as well. So extermination of the bison. The last event we're going to look at is the battle at Wounded Knee. So what ends up happening is we have some American troops who are actually Custer's old regiment. They end up taking 350 Sioux to what we call is Wounded Knee Creek. And we're not sure who fired the first shot, but they were ordering the Native Americans, or the Sioux tribe, to give up their weapons, and they refused. So what ends up happening, we have a shootout between the Sioux tribe and the U.S. Army. And the U.S. Army, they end up killing over 300 unarmed Native Americans. And many of these Native Americans are children and women as well. They end up leaving them in the cold. So it's snowing at this time of year. And this marks the end of the Indian War. Your second question, why do you think the assimilation policy of the Dawes Act failed? So give me specific examples.